It is quite possible that without an Eastern influence, Americans would have never gotten past the narratively and visually simplistic films from Walt Disney. Due to the globalization of media, a market and desire for creatively and stylistically distinct American animations, such as Fantastic Mr. Fox and Ratatouille, began. This is not to say that Japan is purely responsible for the creation of these films, but American access to films like Akira spurred a nationwide shift in our perception of animation as a medium. This was further pushed by what might be the greatest and most profound exposure to Eastern animation America could have ever had the privilege to experience, this being the films from Studio Ghibli, most notably those under the direction of legendary artist Hayao Miyazaki. A number of his films could be considered masterpieces in their own right. However, when it comes to his magnum opus, it would be hard to put anything above the action fantasy epic, Princess Mononoke. I'm not an expert on animation forms, but the aspect that always jumps out to me about Miyazaki's work is the timeless appearance of the films, which is no doubt a result of the hand-drawn traditional animation style. Computer-generated animation has become the norm, and fantastic films that use it, like The Incredibles, now look somewhat dated, especially when compared to Princess Mononoke, which came out 7 years prior and still holds up. This is most apparent when comparing faces, foliage, and flame effects. And even though Princess Mononoke does include some computer-generated animation for things like visualizing the writhing corruption, it is masterfully blended with the absolutely incredible celluloids used. In an NHK documentary on Miyazaki's process behind the creation of Ponyo, which was notably a completely hand-drawn movie, it is described that
creating 5 seconds worth of footage takes an entire week. It's slow, demanding work.
It may purely be a product of my personal preference, as The Incredibles still looks great, but the countless hours spent drawing Princess Mononoke really does show. So much so that pretty much every frame is visually stunning in its own way, and they flow together to portray realistically fluid movement. In the NHK documentary, he says, which is a good representation of his status as a true auteur. Whereas most animated films have a script to build off of, Miyazaki starts his pre-production with a single image. This is the foundation for his movie and highlights the uniquely visual experiences his films are able to occupy. This becomes a set of images called an image board, not to be confused with a storyboard. The idea is to find an interesting and entertaining picture to act as a core concept for a scene, character, or even the film as a whole. After the central idea for the film is established,
he pencils in each scene of the storyboard by hand.
During the production of scenes, animators do take over and draw the frames, but every single image is checked by Miyazaki. Anything that doesn't live up to his standards, he redraws or edits. This process gets him intimately familiar with each scene and character. As with every movie, he does not work at it alone, but the process occurs under his watchful eye, allowing him extensive creative control and freedom. This also means that the product is largely reliant on his tireless effort. A fundamental motif that has always stuck out to me in Hayao Miyazaki's films is environmental stewardship. While it is in no way the sole reason for my current state of ideals, the role of formative art in my intellectual and emotional development cannot be understated. Of the many movies and TV shows that I consumed as a child, few have translated into any sort of lasting enjoyment as an adult. The ones that have acted as a foundation for my cinematic palette. The Ghibli films, specifically Spirited Away and Castle in the Sky, are some of the most vivid early memories I have of enjoying a work that I have continued to appreciate throughout my life. I didn't see Princess Mononoke until I was a freshman in high school, 3 years before I became committed to a life in environmental science, but still long after I started to establish my tastes in media. I had seen most of what Ghibli made up to this point, but could not have anticipated anything like Mononoke being in the repertoire. The film establishes right away that it is not for children and should not be consumed like My Neighbor Totoro, Kiki's Delivery Service, or Castle in the Sky. This is marked by the decision not to shy away from blood, gore, and brutal violence, but does not stop there. While the plot is fairly simple in its presentation, enormous depth lies in the characters, as motivations are often nuanced and invite extensive analysis. Regardless, the story itself is both increasingly relevant and, save for the fantastical elements, historically feasible. The film opens bombastically. Our protagonist, Ashitaka, has to fight off a demon, a boar that has been corrupted by an iron ball shot deep into his body by Lady Eboshi, the leader of Irontown. Despite winning the fight, Ashitaka is cursed by the corruption to die. This sets the stage for the story the audience has to prepare for: the inevitable decay of nature as humans extend their reach into the forest, and the accompanying death of gods. Eboshi is perhaps the most interesting character in her motivations and actions. She does considerable good for people and would be considered by many to be a philanthropist if she was living today. She buys the contracts of brothel workers, giving them a better alternative to life than sex work, and provides refuge for social outcasts, notably lepers, who were heavily discriminated against at the time. She has them work for her to make guns, which brings up the question of the ethics of weapon manufacture in war. Irontown is at conflict with a local feudal lord, Asano, who seeks to conquer them. Having guns is a means of protection in this respect, and is saving the lepers and brothel workers from a much harsher life. However, the guns are also used against the gods of the forest, driving them into insanity. The singularly human ideal of placing people's livelihoods over the collective lives of a forest or the environment in general reigns true here. Eboshi regrets that Ashitaka was cursed because he's a human, yet fails to realize the harm she has enacted and enabled on others. Even a literal god capable of abstract thought and speech is not exempt from her narrow-mindedness as she brushes aside the anthropomorphic creature as a mere brainless pig. She clearly cares greatly about humanity, and shows remarkable compassion for refugees, but retains a diametric opposition to nature. This stems from her view that the land and its inhabitants are resources to harvest. This is an exceptionally modern view, which is shared by most capitalist nations. The spurring force of industrialization is the exploitation of the local natural materials, the stage Irontown is in right now. When the surrounding environment becomes depleted, cities have to travel further and take more in a never-ending cycle of overharvesting and exhaustion of material deposits. For powerful enough nations, this pushes them to colonize and enforce exploitation upon less industrially equipped states as a means of material expansion and maintaining the status quo. This can all be avoided through sustainable development and resource use. Ignoring this is not without its repercussions. In the film, the Nightwalker destroys Irontown. In real life, climate change forces us to acknowledge and change our consumption habits in order to avoid self-destruction. The title character, San, fights against Irontown with the wolves and their goddess, Moro. From the town's point of view, she's essentially an eco-terrorist akin to the Unabomber. From San's point of view, she's protecting the forest, her home, and her family from the destructive and ever-expanding human race. Both sides are explored and represented quite clearly through the impartial view of Ashitaka on his journey to see with eyes unclouded by hate. The morally ambiguous quality of the film and its portrayal of humans and the environment allows the audience to form their own views on who holds the ethical high ground. The forest grows back, but at the cost of its spirit, which drives home the fragility of the natural world. Especially in an age of relentless expansion and overpopulation, there are very few untouched, truly wild areas left on Earth. Invasive species spread by people and anthropogenically caused changes to the global climate have induced mass extinction and widespread ecosystem collapse. The view of man versus nature was a fundamental aspect of American westward expansion, conquering the frontier and spreading industry, which was essential in birthing the nation I live in today. As I benefit off of it, it's hard to watch a movie which reflects so vividly a conflict that is now entirely in the past. In America, the forest never had a fighting chance, and now it relies on the benevolence and pity of humans to survive. Princess Mononoke shows an alternate reality in which the forest, in all its power, even with a god of life and death to protect it, still loses to the perpetual human advancement. It is a tragedy, but one we can learn from. The end of the movie is decidedly upbeat despite the devastation. The land can heal, and humans and nature can coexist.